of the things that I always try to emphasize to students is that you're really trying to answer a policy question utilizing the materials available in the course. After all, this is for many of you is an introduction to public policy analysis. For others of you who have a background in public policy, what I'm hoping is that it introduces you to a couple different ways of thinking about policy analysis. And so this module talks about how to write the paper. And the next several modules are going to introduce you to important concepts and ideas that I'd like to see you work into the paper. From Bardach's book, scientists and public policy experts and economists. And as such, I think that separating out the discussion of how the paper should be written is very useful, and I want you all to refer back many times. And so even though you're not going to be working on the material for grade, it's going to be your pathway to completing the public policy paper. So what do we have included here? Well, one of the first things that I decided to include, or actually it's one of the last things I decided to include, but one of the first things that I hope you look at is Tim Harford's Annoying Problems and Cognitive Reflection Problems. I noticed that a lot of times one of the catches that we have, one of the mistakes that we make, is that we utilize numbers incorrectly. After all, numbers, as you read Stone, you'll see that the numbers are designed to help you tell a story. And in some ways also, if you pay attention to Bardach and Michael Munger, an economist and political scientist we're going to be reading about in coming modules, they want you to use numbers to help you figure things out. And if you do that incorrectly, then you're going to compound your problems. Harford gives an example of a intersection that has a number of major accidents and a number of minor accidents, and how so often we look at the table that produces and come to improper or incorrect results. And I think what I'd like you all to look at is I'd like you to look at how exactly your causes and effects work in terms of numbers as you're working through your paper. But anyway, I find it informative. Much of the rest of the module, though, talks about the paper as far as selecting a topic is concerned. You're going to be writing something called the policy question assignment. Every semester I consider changing the title to the policy problem assignment. This is a problem-based course. I've mentioned before that one of the things that we want to do in this course is start with the problem and work through to an answer. We want to start with a problem, decide what it would look like if we had fixed the problem or ameliorated the problem. What is better than today? And there should be some quantifiable way or some clearly visible way, at least, that any solution that we choose fixes. In fact, before we have a solution, we should already know what a fix is. If we had unemployment at, say, 7%, and we decided that full employment, other than people who are just between jobs temporarily, was more like 4% or 3.5%, then we would say fixed is taking 7% and changing it to 3.5%. Or maybe we say, what is fixed with the coronavirus? Does that mean that nobody in America suffers from COVID-19? Or does it mean that we've lowered it to some manageable level or some acceptable level, right? So often it's our responsibility to choose at what point we're going to stop caring about the problems of others. And you say, well, that's pretty stark, but if you think about it, there's many, many problems in the world that people don't pay an awful lot of attention to because those problems seem relatively small. When you think that there's a limited number of resources in the world to solve problems, sometimes what you do is you decide, yes, this would be something that in a perfect world I'd fix, and yet you don't, right? Why don't we have a system that shoots asteroids out of the sky if they start to approach Earth, right? Because we have technical limitations and we have other problems, and maybe we're lazy. In any case, if you are looking at the problems that I've laid out that you might select from, or maybe you have a policy problem that interests you, try to make sure that in your proposal that at first you eliminate any implied solution. If the solution is, for instance, if your desire is the tax cut, which I've mentioned elsewhere, then that's actually a policy. That's actually a policy alternative. What is the problem? Is the problem that you just pay too much taxes? No, nobody ever says that. Nobody ever says that. People who want to legalize marijuana, they never say, well, I want to legalize marijuana just because I want to smoke marijuana. Or I have a friend who wants, there's always like, oh, there's this poor person in jail, or oh, there's this amount of money that we need to raise. Okay, well, if you think that there's money that we need to raise to run the government, then you have to compare marijuana legalization to all other alternatives for funding the government. Maybe there's other ways that are more decent and fair. Somebody could say that any excise tax, any sales tax, any value-added tax is really a tax on the poorest people who utilize resources at a close approximation of the same amount. They're more likely to spend it given their income than a wealthy person who's more likely to save given his income. Have you ever noticed that saving money, something that wealthy people are more able to do, is rewarded by the government? I mean, it helps the government, but does it really help poor people? I don't know. You should think about that, especially if you're a socialist, right? If you're just a run-of-the-mill person, then you're mostly looking out for the average guy. And if you're looking out for the average guy, well, maybe the average guy needs some special way to save money that will benefit him at the expense of others. Well, once you have a problem, then you shift to try to say, well, how would that problem be fixed? Not what method would you use, but what would it look like if it were fixed? And then your next step, only then do you start to look at what alternatives you might choose. One of your alternatives should be the status quo. After all, you're going to learn in a couple weeks that the typical state of any policy in the United States is equilibrium. That it's very hard to change things. There's small incremental changes, but not massive changes. Well, those small incremental changes add up over time. However, if you have some moment, some point in time where there's an opportunity, perhaps a focusing event, you can get a lot of change in a short period of time. And at least while you're writing your paper, you should consider whether you're trying to make a change to policy that's likely in the short term, or whether you're just trying to come up with an alternative that might be possible in the event that some crisis causes people to be looking for alternatives. Beyond that, even this module has a section on the directions for the paper. You should read them closely, figure out as best as you can what they mean. If you're the kind of person who works better with bullet points than with paragraphs, you should try to unpack the paragraphs into the things that you're being asked to do. If you are the type of person who doesn't understand, I guess that's not a type of person, that's a person in any given situation. If you don't understand the directions, probably the best person to ask is me. And asking now rather than in a few weeks could be very profitable to you. Included in this section is the policy paper rubric. Ideally, when you look at the rubric, you're going to see the grade that you should get, and it should be obvious to you the grade that you're going to get when you turn the paper in, because I describe pretty closely what I'm looking for, not 3 points for this and 5 points for that, but instead I'm showing you the sort of standard that the paper sets for the various grades. This is a very critical paper. It counts for 40% of your grade. So you should suspect that very high quality, at least the best that you can do, would be necessary for you to get the best grade that you can get. I would hope that all of you have as a goal an A for this course. I'm certainly, my goal for you is to get an A in this course. And so, you should look at the rubric and you should say, well, this is what he thinks a perfect paper would be. This is what he's going to require just to get an A. And, maybe you're doing so well in everything else and you say, okay, but this is what I need for a B, and then maybe I could still get an A. But you should have those standards in your mind as you're writing the paper, and you say, well, am I really engaged in high quality research, or am I kind of just trying to slough through? Be honest with yourself. There's nothing in the world better than being tough on yourself and then discovering that the world isn't as tough on you. Unless that tends to get you down, and then you have to kind of give yourself a break sometimes. I have a section on the elements of a good policy paper. This is a voiceover PowerPoint presentation. I think that it's very informative and very useful. I'm repurposing it from a previous semester, so if there's a word wrong, like if I say you need this done by January, check the actual due date. But I've watched the video through a couple times, and I would have made the correction if I would have caught it. So I suspect that it's just as true. My goal when I was doing this PowerPoint was that these are statements that are true of any policy paper that would ever be required in this course. I've included a policy paper checklist, and you should have this with you both as you write and later on when you are going over your paper, to make sure that you have all the things in it that are required, or at least all the things in it that I think would make your paper stronger. So often there's small mistakes that, I look at a paper and I say, oh, you know what, 20 more minutes would have meant a grade higher. And so I created this policy paper checklist to try to get rid of the tiny problems that affect grades. And I would say that a surprisingly large number of papers lose points because students forget, I guess forget, the length that the paper is supposed to be. So if you have an 8-page paper, I have to ask you, wasn't there anything else you knew? That's sort of the assumption, right, of any person who grades a paper and marks points off for not writing a long enough paper, is that you've included everything you know about a topic and it just wasn't enough to fill the space provided. You know, it's a real tragedy if there was a lot more that you could have said. And I'll tell you, I think sometimes the reason why students don't finish is, you know, I see when the papers are turned in. If a paper gets turned in at 11:58 on the day it's due, then, and it's 8 pages long, I sit there and I say, I wonder if the student could have, you know, in another couple hours, written a much better paper. On the other hand, I really don't want to see your first draft of a paper. You know, the second draft, maybe I'll look at the second draft of your paper. But the first person to look at your paper and determine whether it's any good, it should be you. And so, you know, if something is obvious as it's not long enough, it hasn't been addressed. If you haven't looked through the checklist, if you haven't looked at the directions, if you haven't looked at the rubric to see how you've done, then you have to ask, you know, are you really doing the work? The amazing thing is that so many students are. The amazing thing is that so many papers are really very good. But it's also sad for those students who don't do that. It's sad for the students who have the potential to get an A or a B in an upper level college course, but instead, because of some small problem, and you know, in some ways, the problem of not starting 3 weeks early, but instead starting 2 days early, is a small problem. It's just a problem of planning. I will tell you, everybody will tell you, don't start your paper the night before it's due, or don't start your research a week before the paper's due. Be doing the research right along. And the truth is, you're the smart kids. Maybe you're very much an adult now, right? But you were the smart kids, and so you could do less work and do it closer to the deadline, and the grade still was amazing or good enough. And so, you know, now you say, well, there's 709 things that I need to do before I start my paper. And I would ask you, wouldn't it be smarter maybe to put off one of those things, balancing your checkbook, whatever, and get a good start on your paper? And then once you know how much time is left, or once you're no longer scared that you won't finish the paper in time, then go balance the checkbook. Maybe you should pull an all-nighter with 3 weeks left. Just not literally, but maybe you should work 3, 4, 5 hours on a paper well before it's due. Because if you accidentally find that that's enough and you're done, then what's the tragedy in that? But if you find out the night that the paper's due that 2 or 3 hours or 5 hours wasn't enough, then there's a real problem. I have a section on the note on source quality. Not all sources are equal. Obviously, a government report on one of your policy problems is going to be more readily accepted by the neutral observer than, you know, a blog post by a friend of yours, or a statement by an advocacy group. Yes, I know that the government, in a way, is an advocacy group all to itself, and the most powerful, right? I was watching a program, I forget which one, and the person says, well, you know, they've won 2 world wars and they print their own money. Maybe you shouldn't mess with them. On the other hand, you have to know that they have people who do their research for them, are experts, And, and you might find experts who are speaking on this, and that's what we're looking for, is expertise. We don't necessarily have expertise in our policy area, but one of the keys to being a policy analyst is to know where to go to find it, or to at least find good, high quality reports or information. Sometimes it's wrong, but I like to look at sources as, friends who are walking down a dark alley with you. So if you are walking down the dark alley and you're being accosted, people might step away. If you have, imagine those government reports, and imagine your advocacy group, and imagine this policy paper written by a think tank, and they're standing behind you. Some American government professor, or some a director of administration at an agency somewhere might be more likely to back down from the fight with you if they see these tough guys behind you. It's always good to have a crew, and your paper's crew is the sources that it can cite. So also the policy question assignments directions are here. The policy question assignment rubric is here. It's pretty simple. It says, follow these directions. I promise you'll get a good grade. I strongly recommend that as you're scheduling your appointments, that you do a little bit of background research on what you care about. And almost no matter what you decide you care about, you're going to have to narrow it down. Try to think of all of the things in the world that can be completely described in 10 to 12 pages. Putting together your television is only, there's a lot of white space there, but the booklet they give you for installing a brand new, smart TV is longer than 12 pages. If you think about the directions that a government agency would write on how to hire somebody to mow the lawn of a park in Atlanta, we're starting to talk about how long this paper is going to be. On the other hand, it doesn't have to be in the same detail, right, as the hiring manual for a City of Atlanta employee. But you need to narrow down your topic. So, if you're thinking about, I want to write about federal parks, and I want to write about the problems of federal parks, try to find one problem of one federal park, or maybe one problem that all the parks have, and you're closer to what you're really looking to try to accomplish. And I strongly recommend that you come with a good idea of something that you can care about for one semester when we talk. And we'll be trying to get all of those scheduled in the next 2 weeks. So anyway, I wish you all well. And if you have any questions for me, please send me emails. There's nothing scarier than having students not send you emails. You like to dream that that's because they all know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. But, at 3 a.m., the dark night of the soul, you're a little bit worried that students are so lost that they don't even know. All right, good luck, and I will be talking to you all again very soon.